All right, let's get started. Good afternoon. For some of you, good morning and even good evening. And welcome to almost 90 registered participants here in Zoom and another 90 registered YouTube live stream viewers. My name is Tobias von Lossow. I'm a research fellow at the Klingendahl Institute and project manager of the Planetary Security Initiative, with a background in water security and climate security in the Middle East and Africa. I'm the moderator of this webinar, Climate Interventions and Peace in the Age of COVID-19. We will have three speakers that at first will be interviewed by me in the next 25 to 30 minutes. Afterwards, we will have another about half an hour in which participants here in the Zoom room can raise questions. Please use for that the Q&A function that you find at the bottom of your screen. You can already type in your questions, by the way, while the speakers are still giving input. Finally, we will conclude the event with a spoken column by a fourth speaker sketching out how climate change will or might affect and shape the global security agenda and debate in the month to come. This public session is organized by the Klingendahl Institute in the framework of the Planetary Security Initiative, PSI. PSI aims to promote best practice, strategic entry points, and new approaches to reducing climate-related risks to conflict and stability, and thus promoting sustainable peace in a changing climate. The aim of today's webinar is to look into developments in the field of climate security. And of course, in this context, we will touch upon COVID-19 and how this phenomenon shapes the discourses, the policymaking, and also action on the ground. We will discuss the climate security nexus from a military, a diplomacy, and a development perspective, with the following four distinguished speakers that will share their insights and thoughts with us this afternoon. First, my colleague, Dr. Louise van Schrijck, head of the unit EU and Global Affairs at the Klingendahl Institute and coordinator of the climate change research at the Institute. Second, we hear Thomas Ritzer from the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs at the United Nations in New York. Third, we welcome Selena Victor, Senior Director and Policy and Advocacy at Mercy Corps Europe in London. And for the concluding column, we will hear General Tom Middendorp, Senior Associate Fellow at the Klingendahl Institute and Chair of the International Military Council on Climate and Security, IMCCS. After this short introduction, we want to move on to the first speaker. Louise van Schrijck will discuss the role of the military, so coming more from the hard security angle in this debate, and present key findings of a report that recently published by Klingendahl. So let me start with a very generic question, Louise. Why should the military care about climate change? Is it the new enemy? And if it is such a new enemy, isn't COVID-19 in these days not the much bigger risk to security, stability, and peace?
Yes, thank you, Tobias. Yes, it's true that climate change is not, let's say, similar to a traditional enemy that seeks to expand its powers to the detriment of others by using force. And this is how we used to know the enemy. At the same time, we know it's a tremendous challenge for the military, and it may be even a bigger one than such traditional enemies have ever been. Climate change has consequences for the military with regard to its tasks, with regard to its mission preparations, early warning, and risk assessments. And we should also not forget that the military is itself a big contributor to the emissions that cause climate change. So in our Klingendahl study, Ready for Takeoff, because we acknowledge that the military is also itself interested in looking more into the climate change impacts, we looked at the military in 11 countries, and we found that very often climate change not only acts as a threat multiplier in the theaters of military operations, so abroad, but also has direct implications for military capabilities at home, because it leads also to increased calls for civil assistance in these home territories because of the extreme weather. And it can even directly affect military capabilities and strengths, since these extreme weather events can also dilute the value of military assets. For instance, if you consider the damage done by the regular floodings of the Norfolk Navy bases in the US, but also the wildfires in Southeast Australia were not very good for the military assets in that part of the world. So extreme weather and the need to operate, for instance, in extreme heat and cold are not new issues for military organizations. But with climate change, the situation, the conditions are really deteriorating, and the sheer amount of requests for military assistance at home and abroad can be expected to increase, or is already increasing. So in a way, it's also, of course, true that the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdowns that are installed in many countries at this point in time cause higher and more immediate security risks. We see that conflict and security analysts, also some of our own colleagues, have found already that instability is on the rise with the lockdowns, and also that there is more potential for oppression, and also that terrorist groups are exploiting the current situation in some regions of the world to use these additional grievances among the citizens, or among people, for recruitment purposes. And we also see that the pandemic, in a similar way, also leads to more calls for assistance by the military to support health systems, build emergency hospitals, repatriate people and military. So it's another, let's say, non-traditional security threat. What we also can see with the COVID-19 is that, in similar way with the Paris Agreement, we also see this heightened powers tensions between the global powers. So we see, for instance, that the World Health Organization is now also the subject, of controversy, and also we see an increase in the spread of online warfare and disinformation. And such impacts we can also expect, if more what used to be called natural disasters, but disasters are, it's also very important how you deal with them. But if extreme weather occurs more frequently, you might also get similar impacts and calls for the military. And yes, unfortunately, despite that Corona leads now to a drop of emissions, it's not cannot be expected that climate change will be halted because of the Corona epidemic. That has to do simply with the fact that CO2 stays into the atmosphere for about a century, and also that the patterns underlying the emissions that are very closely linked to the current way we are now doing our economic activities have not yet shifted structurally. So despite the Corona crisis now being perhaps the biggest security threat and the immediate threat, climate change continues to be the threat multiplier that it is, and it's already undermining military capabilities. So there's still not an excuse not to act, let's say. Yeah, okay, I'll end
working for a Dutch think tank, why is the Netherlands interested in this topic? Is it because their own territory is at risk, thinking of rising sea levels?
Yeah, this is a question, and I'm sure that Tom Millendorp, who's here, also agrees that is asked often. Is the Netherlands particularly concerned about climate change because a large part of its country is laying below sea level? I think this is not, let's say, the main reason for why the Dutch is engaged, because we are pretty good in water management, and we also believe that we will be good in keeping the sea out of the country, even if the sea level is rising. However, climate change for the Netherlands also means that the weather is changing here, and the general public and the government are concerned about this, and also that climate change seems to have been gotten a kind of irreversible character. For instance, last year and also this year, we see quite a bit of drought and low precipitation, and that also has consequences for agricultural production. The Dutch also consider the need to decarbonize as a chance for innovative leapfrogging, and are also phasing out gas production at home, because we were also confronted with some modest earthquakes in the north of the Netherlands where this gas is explored. However, I think for the military, the most important wake-up call to consider climate change was really the 2017 Hurricane Irma that almost fully destroyed the French-Dutch island of Sint Maarten in the Caribbean. So at that point in time, the Navy, the armed forces were called upon for assistance. And this was not only to provide food, water, and shelter, but also simply to maintain law and order, since looting had started on the island in the aftermath of the hurricane. So all of a sudden it was realized that climate change was not a far away issue because of climate change, the intensity of hurricanes in the region, in the Caribbean region, increases. And also at this time, the island of Sint Maarten is still struggling politically and economically to recover. So for the Kingdom of the Netherlands, it became clear that also our own territory is vulnerable to climate impact, and that in addition to, for instance, mission areas such as Afghanistan, but also the Arctic, the Sahel, Middle East, also other regions of the world can be expected to experience severe impact of climate change with security implications. So here.
Yeah, let me one last question, maybe. Do you see that climate change might be used to claim more budget for the military in the future for new equipment? And is it also maybe a new motivation for military interventions?
Yeah, that's actually something in this field, in the field of climate security. I notice a lot of fear and suspicion about engaging the military. So often military organizations are considered to be part of the problem, specifically in countries torn by conflict. So I can also understand that. And also a reason for it is that in many situations in this space, it's considered that development efforts or diplomacy efforts are the main ways to prevent and tackle conflicts over water, food, and land that have become more scarce due to climate change. And in that way, that's the way basically to promote stability by bringing in development and diplomacy capabilities. Well, I'm quite sure that the other two speakers, Thomas and Selina, will convince you that it's relevant to use these approaches, the development and diplomacy interventions, and also that it's necessary to scale them up. And at the Planetary Security Initiative, of course, we also realize this and we see the value of these practices. However, at the same time, we realize that in some situations, military interventions are still necessary and unavoidable. And also that from a military perspective, you want to know where in the future the risk is highest. So how to ensure that you can prevent military missions actually adding to these existing scarcities of natural resources and tensions in regions. And also how this distribution of resources may increase tensions in mission environments. So this is also a reason why the UN Security Council, and Thomas might be able perhaps later on to say a bit more about it, why some of the UN missions have now been mandated to look at climate change when in their mission environment. So even if the military may not be able to, directly address root causes of conflict linked to climate change, they could still avoid making the situation worse. And they can also point humanitarian actors, which are also active on the ground, into the right direction. And they can also possibly provide some safe space for diplomats to mediate, to set up dialogues among conflicting partners, and also to help development actors to re-enter areas which might become a little bit safer because the military is there, and restart with projects that address scarcities and recreate new livelihoods for the people living there. So, and then to your other question, do they use it, as an argument for more money and military tools? Yes, probably yes, because it is true that because of climate change, they will be called upon more often at home and abroad. So then you also need more budget and capabilities to address that. And it's also true that they want to invest in decarbonization. Probably not only because this is good for the emission reductions, but also because if you operate military missions in the field, you also don't want to be overly dependent on oil and diesel, because you have to safeguard all these these supply lines, and that's also putting additional lives at risk in mission areas. So in the past, we have seen how military research and development also has fantastic societal spin-offs, such as, for instance, the intervention of the internet. So I think we should also not be too afraid if the military enthusiastic embraces, let's say, more research and innovation into low carbon technologies. Because it might benefit them, but it may also have, let's say, greater societal spin-offs, and also be relevant for other sectors that can learn from that. Yeah. All right, I leave it here. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Louisa. Let's move on to, you mentioned it already, the other sectors and Thomas. So we move on to Thomas Ritzer from the DPPA at the UN. He will discuss environmental peace-building practices in the realm of diplomacy and also under the umbrella of the climate security mechanism. So maybe first of all, Thomas, what is the climate security mechanism and how does it contribute to reducing security risks related to climate change?
Thank you, Tobias, and thank you also to Louisa for her really interesting first round of contributions here. Looking forward to having some discussion later on as well. In terms of the climate security mechanism, or the CSM, as we call it for shorthand, it's essentially an interagency initiative that was launched in 2018 jointly by the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, where I'm housed, so to speak, and the UN Development Program and the UN Environment Program. And that was made possible initially by a generous contribution from Sweden at the time. So the CSM is a small but dedicated team that's drawn from these three agencies, and a team that seeks to strengthen UN capacity to address climate-related security risks in a more systematic and a more integrated manner. The UN, already has a lot of expertise in a range of different policy areas, but too often really they work in silos. So broadly speaking, then, from the CSM perspective, our goal is initially to connect these different areas of expertise, to bring them together to address climate-related security risks from multiple angles, because that's the approach we need. It is too complex of an issue to just have a very monolithic and single issue approach to it. So we want to bring them together, build upon these existing expertises, and help make, in the end, then ultimately climate adaptation and mitigation work a bit more conflict sensitive. At the same time, make the peace and security work in the UN and also for other partners more climate informed. This is really sort of bringing them together into the center where oftentimes it feels like climate security falls in between the cracks. The siloed expertise of peace and security actors on one hand, and the siloed expertise of adaptation, climate change, disaster risk reduction, and other type of technical expertises. So the early days of the CSM were a lot about raising this sort of awareness, bring the topic onto the agenda of the UN and other partner organizations, building these partnerships to have these kinds of conversations, and really to sort of lay the conceptual foundation for a more systematic engagement in the UN on the issue of climate security. We have, for instance, produced a guidance package called the Climate Security Toolbox that is now available online for all partners to look at, with multiple different documents that can help practitioners and researchers think through the issue of climate-related security risks, and talk about that later if there's interest. But also now, as we have sort of laid this foundation, our focus now is very much on creating concrete impact on the ground, and that happens oftentimes also through the means of, through the channel, so to speak, of peace building. More concretely, maybe the priority areas in which the climate security mechanism is active and can support partners within the UN, but also outside the UN, is one, sort of supporting analysis to better understand the impact of climate change on peace and security in a very contextual and very much tailored manner. It's about understanding the pathways, and it's about understanding how climate change impacts not just the environment, but the broader mandates of the UN system, thinking about conflict prevention, thinking about sustaining peace, and also the SDGs under the 2030 agenda. A second area of focus for the CSM is the development of prevention and response strategies. So building on the analysis we have to trigger action. Obviously, analysis in and of itself is not really a goal. It's only as useful as it can lead to concrete action. So our focus in here is to find innovative solutions, both on a developmental side through programmatic and projects, intervention on that side, but also through the integration of climate change into political and mediation strategies. And lastly, or a third focus area is knowledge management and advocacy, where it's about building a global knowledge base. It's about creating the partnerships that allow us to work together, exchange information, and jointly move forward in the area of climate security. It's about advocating for the integration of climate security into the realms of, as you have it here in this panel, the military, the political side, the development side. It's sort of a lot of communications and advocacy work around that. And of course, it's about building the capacity, both within the UN, but also amongst partners. And I'll just end on the note to say that partnerships really is critical within the UN and outside the UN. And Louisa touched on this as well a little bit. There's an important element to the understanding that sort of the confluence of risks coming together under the mantle of climate security that can only be addressed if we leverage our respective resources and capacities and bring this together. And the CSM is trying to work at the nexus of where these things come together.
Thanks. I mean, you mentioned already the three focus areas. Could you give us maybe one or two concrete examples where peace building already benefited from adding or integrating a climate lens?
Yeah, first off, I would maybe flag that climate security as a label in which we think about this type of work now may be quite new, but that the work on integrating a climate lens into peace building has been around for a while, and vice versa as well. Think about the peace building aspect of development work. Thinking here, for instance, about some of this really excellent work that's been done in the areas of food security or alternative livelihoods, and all of those are very relevant in a broader sense to both peace building and climate adaptation. So then I think from a peace building perspective, the question really is not so much whether climate change is an important factor to consider, but how climate change impacts our work. Because in most cases, there will be an important climate change element that we need to understand to really trigger the long-term sustainable impact that we seek with our peace building work. We already see that the demand for this type of work is growing, especially when it comes to thinking about cross-border solutions. Climate change, of course, one of those mega threats we see in the world now that does not respect borders and affects regions at once. So here the UN certainly is faced with the challenge of finding cross-border solutions, and we see more and more demand for support and guidance in this work. And that's where the Secretary General's Peace Building Fund can play a very important role. The Peace Building Fund just came out with a new 5-year strategy that gives climate security a very prominent place for the first time. So we will hopefully see even more programming going forward in this area. It may be interesting also to flag the PBF has almost 30, the Peace Building Fund has almost 30 projects now that sort of fall into this area of climate security that they are supporting. And they can be broken up in three, or roughly divided in three different areas. The first area is around the prevention and resolution of herder farmer conflicts, a conflict to do with land ownership more broadly. The second one is about natural resource management. And the third one is about building resilience to climate change, understanding that this type of resilience will also prepare as well for other challenges. In terms of concrete examples, there are of course then several to choose from, but maybe one that takes us away a little bit from the Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa and Middle East centered lens that oftentimes the conversation on climate security assumes in a way. And that would be an example from the Pacific. It's also the first project under the auspices of the Peace Building Fund that is specifically focused on climate security. It's also regional, so it covers several countries. In that sense, it really is a bit of a groundbreaking, very new and innovative initiative. It builds on the recognition of the Pacific member states in 2018 that climate change is the biggest threat to security in the region. That was formulated in the so-called Boy Declaration from about 2 years ago now. And the PBF project here seeks to help the Pacific Islands Forum, the regional organization in the Pacific, help the PIF and member states to translate this declaration, to translate the words into concrete action to really address these issues. There are several things that the project is seeking to achieve. I'll maybe just highlight 3 of them. One is to provide the technical support to analyze more comprehensively and also develop comprehensive responses then to climate-related security risks. In the process of the analysis and response development, of course, it's also about building lasting capacity, both in the Pacific Islands Forum as well as member states. Another area would be strengthen the involvement of communities, especially women and youth, throughout the implementation of the project and throughout the formulation, first the analysis and then the formulation of response strategies to climate security risks. And thirdly, in the realm of very concrete peace building projects, the project will seek to find high-risk areas and address them through a number of different avenues, which could include strengthening artisanal fisheries, building local conflict resolution mechanisms. It could also be about producing and marketing more climate resilient products, the sort of zoning of protected areas to increase food and water security in the region. So there are multiple different entry points then, but it's a very innovative and really exciting project that is about to get underway in the Pacific with the support of the Peace Building Fund right now.
All right, you already mentioned implicitly COVID-19, so let's get more explicit on that challenge. Do you see any lessons from COVID-19, from the pandemic, that could benefit the climate, the diplomatic work in the field of climate security in your work?
Yeah, definitely. I think there are plenty of parallels between COVID-19 and climate change and the impact of climate change on peace and security. I think for one, for instance, COVID-19 certainly has raised our awareness globally and our understanding of complex risks that have to do with the relationship between humans and the environment, between humans and nature. Those are risks that may be invisible and may not, as Louise was saying, may not sort of come with our typical understanding of an enemy, but as invisible and untypical and sort of novel as they are, they have achieved a scale in the case of COVID-19 and also climate change, have reached a scale and a level that will necessarily affect the well-being and ultimately maybe also the stability and the security of people. There's sort of large ripple effects that go across societies, and that's something where hopefully the awareness we have gathered through the COVID-19 experience will also translate into our thinking about climate change. Other parallels is just the global and regressive nature of both COVID-19 and climate change, in the sense that they don't affect all people equally, and to really expose and compound underlying weaknesses, vulnerabilities that already exist. They also both demonstrate sort of the importance of global public goods. That includes health environments and also broader societal systemic issues that help us increase the resilience of states and communities. And both really, I feel like, demonstrate the overlapping nature of crisis these days. The confluence of different risk factors that we see in our interconnected world coming together is an important lesson that COVID-19 taught us that can also translate into climate change. But in terms of concrete policy lessons, I think there are a couple of things we can really take away. One is that clearly, if there's political will, we can take dramatic action. And we've seen this in COVID-19. There is the ability of the world and of member states and at the subnational level to take dramatic action and reverse course if we really have to do it. But also, we realize that if we wait too long to take this action, it has to become very dramatic action. If we now think about the lockdown in so many places in the world, and of course the sad loss of tremendous amounts of life before that, the longer we wait, the more dramatic the action has to be. And that I think also very much applies to climate change. Another one is that we need to trust science and conduct forward-looking analysis and examinations of the environment around us. We need to share knowledge, work together on these issues, and we can't politicize certain elements of our engagement with some of these risk factors. A third one, I think, is really the focus on resilience. Sort of, we need to put a premium on building resilience of societies. Few amongst the sort of pandemic coming, and now that it's here and hit us with full force, we've realized that the pandemic strikes many of the same weaknesses and vulnerabilities that other crises, including climate change, will strike as well. And we don't know really what the next crisis will look like. I mean, we know climate change as a crisis is coming, but there will be others. But one thing we know is that resilience as a concept will help societies and communities deal with all of these crises in a better way, make them more absorptive, adaptive, and also strengthen transformative capacity to really overcome these multiple risk factors. And maybe lastly, I would say that COVID has shown us that the way the world has become interconnected today means that isolated crises really are an illusion. If we think we can keep something contained to one part of the world and it won't affect us, that's not how it works anymore. We need multilateral commitment, we need multilateral cooperation to find solutions, global solutions to global problems. And the climate change situation is very much the same, where even if we may not directly be implicated right now by climate change, and obviously other parts of the world or some parts of the world are hit harder than others, the implications on food prices and supply chains and population movements and whatnot will affect the whole world. And I think that's a lesson we hopefully learned from COVID-19 as well.
Thanks. Thank you, Thomas. And yeah, with this call, we move on to Selena Victor. She will add the development perspective that we are still missing in this round, and also by looking into action on the ground. So Selena, Mercy Corps just published a study, Climate Change and Conflict Lessons from Emerging Practice. What different types of activities did you identify? What did you observe here in the climate security space? Selena, did we lose you? Can you hear us?
You froze just at the critical moment. What different types of activities, I think you were about to say.
Okay, what different, probably a critical one. What different types of activities did you identify? What did you observe in the climate security space, in the field of climate security? On my screen, Selena, you're frozen.
I have finally returned. I'm sorry, it's been completely stable throughout the last 20 minutes, but now it's chosen to go wrong. But I read you loud and clear. Yes, let me, first to tell you a little bit about the study. This was something that the UK's Department for International Development funded us to do. It was a fairly quick piece of work to sort of scan our world for the work that was being done at the sort of climate conflict intersection. And we use the expression climate and conflict, not necessarily climate security, which brings in sort of other connotations. There are inherent limitations to that, because it was it's a fairly short time frame, but also, you know, it was based on our own networks, and it was based on those working in the development community. So there is an awful lot of, you know, we acknowledge there's a huge amount of work that's being done that wouldn't have been necessarily captured. So I wanted to premise anything I say about what we found just with that, you know, it's fairly self-selected. Our premise, I think, like many others, is that there's still so much to understand about the precise nature of those links between conflict and climate. But even as that research is done, and even as we get more rigorous, we can assume that that climate change is at least one of the force multipliers for the drivers of conflict, and that conflict could make climate change adaptation and resilience more difficult. And therefore, there's huge value in identifying emerging practice that works at that intersection. So it's a sort of acceptance that there's a certain amount of
Not so stable, the internet connection, at least for me. Selena, can you hear us? Selena, can you hear us? Obviously not. So, oh yeah.
Apologies. Yes.
Could
Where did I lose you?
Probably, yeah, the last minute, approximately.
Okay. If I talk about the case studies that we pulled together, and again, within that sort of limited circle of investigation, by far the majority were programs that were working essentially at the community scale or a little bit beyond on acute conflicts and focused on competition over resources. So we're either talking about programs that lessen the need for that competition or conflict resolution mechanisms. And I would group that into the sort of broad programs. And that was by far the majority of the work. A smaller group was working much more at the systems level. And that's, you know, more in line with the sort of work that Thomas has been talking about integrating climate fragility into national or regional action or policy. So that's the sort of policy area. And then the third category, which I think is a really interesting foundation for all the other work, is around the analytical frameworks that organizations like Mercy Corps are increasingly adopting, that either are integrating conflict into disaster risk assessments or integrating climate change thinking of climate smart analysis into conflict analysis. And a couple of them, a sort of fully agnostic risk analysis. So a couple of frameworks that really did look at whatever risks and shocks are likely to face a particular community, including climate change and conflict.
Could you give us maybe one or two concrete examples of such best practices where it worked out, and what are the essential factors in these cases? What made them succeed in the end?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, I think in terms of, as I said, the programs, the sort of community level acute conflict programs, we had a number of excellent programs that were sort of detailed in the report. I would say that they do have limitations, partly that they're not particularly new. Most of them are natural resource management, environmental peace building, livelihood diversification. I'm not at all saying that those aren't valuable. And actually, I think in a world threatened by conflict and climate threats and a pandemic, and in recognition that these each can compound each other, there's a huge case for much greater investment in these integrated approaches and rigorous analysis to identify which ones are most effective. I don't think it matters if it's old wine in new bottles, as long as the old wine is really effective, then let's do more of it. But I think it's worth noting that a lot of those are looking at climate variability rather than climate change per se, and very few really use serious climate data. So that is a limitation. But then on the systems work that I was talking about, there were two particular case studies that we really liked. One is very much a research piece. This is IISD, have been looking into how national adaptation planning can be done effectively in context of fragility, both ensuring that it is effective adaptation despite the limitations, but also how adaptation planning can contribute to peace outcomes. I think right now it's very much at the research stage and it's looking at what's possible, but also scanning what's already included in national climate adaptation plans around, commitments to preventing land and water use conflicts, particularly those that might arise between pastoralists and farmers. The NAPs for Togo, Kenya, Ethiopia, Sudan, Burkina Faso all have elements that have sort of peace building outcomes included in their national adaptation plan. So that's a very promising and nicely concrete area for investigation. The second is EcoPeace Middle East have a water energy nexus program in Israel, Palestine and Jordan. And they're working to build cooperation across the countries to counter the effects of climate change and the potential negative security implications. What we found interesting, and perhaps it will be less surprising to Thomas or others, was that it is very much using the approaches that NGOs like us would use at the community level and scaling it up to the regional level. So it's resource sharing agreements, it's the development of interdependencies between groups. They were looking at, how Lebanon, I think, could be, a sort of renewable energy source for the region. So they're kind of scaling up those approaches. Alternatively, it may be that we're scaling down approaches that already exist at the regional level. So, each sector thinks that they're the first to invent any of these things. And then on the analytical frameworks, as I say, there are a lot of sort of climate adaptation practitioners who have started to apply conflict sensitivity lenses, Cord Aid, Christian Aid, and there are conflict practitioners who have begun piloting approaches to incorporate climate data alongside their sort of conflict analysis. Concordis had some really interesting work on this. But I think the most interesting are these fully integrated frameworks that can track and prepare for diverse risks. Adelphi, I'm sure everyone knows, has conducted a really deep climate fragility risk assessment in the Lake Chad Basin after 2 years of research, with the aim of presenting that balanced sort of conflict and climate risk assessment. And Mercy Corps ourselves has our own sort of methodology tool, the strategic resilience assessment, that aims to look at any unique context and understand those sort of complex and interconnected drivers of instability that threaten development goals, how they impact different groups, and what are the specific resilience abilities and resources that these groups will need to be able to cope, adapt in the face of those risks. So in essence, it's agnostic. It will identify what are the risks and threats most likely to face this particular community.
Okay, thanks for that. And allow me maybe one last question on COVID-19. Do you consider the epidemic an additional reason to scale up climate security best practices, and what would be the best way to do so? And maybe linked with that, and also, let's say, posing maybe a threat, are you afraid that donors might cut on this relatively new field of activity, climate security?
Yeah, so on your first question there, yes, I do. I think all of us, and particularly NGOs, can be accused of nexusing things into oblivion. I think as we sort of pile everything together, I don't know, what are we in, the quintuple nexus now? We're already seeing, as we would expect, and as everybody's discussed, the pandemic and the secondary effects are of course exacerbating drivers of conflict and violence at those local levels. And actually there are parallels for us in how we're thinking about COVID and its impact on conflict in the way that we think about climate change as the sort of force multiplier. And in parallel, we're seeing shrinking capacity to respond, the shrinking aid budgets, increasing global needs, policymakers completely distracted by domestic needs or political machinations. So I feel now more than ever, in order to be effective, we have to stop working in silos, and we have to stop viewing needs, different categories of need, as in competition with each other. That there is this competition between the adaptation funding, the peace building funding, the humanitarian funding. I think we have to effectively meet the needs and address the threats facing a community in a holistic and evidence-based way, rather than, competing for resources, and to do it more effectively. I think in terms of your last question, things are unfolding quite in real time in the UK, so ask me again on Monday. But I think despite all the other challenges, European governments, including my own, are still very much committed on climate change, and are focused on addressing fragility. And however much we move towards sort of a foreign policy driven aid agenda, that's going to remain in every government's national interest. And I hope, and certainly the signs are, that this will remain a priority.
Thank you. Thank you, Selena. Thank you to the three of you, Louise, Thomas, and Selena, for these valuable inputs. And we would now like to open the floor for questions and come to the Q&A section. I will now call we've already 3 questions in the chat, and we will now allow these 4 persons to unmute themselves, and we will go with the order. So I would ask now Adriana Abdenour to raise her question to the speakers on the panel. Please, Adriana.
Hello. I think you can hear me, but I can no longer hear you. So let me be very brief. Thank you very much. This is a fantastic panel, and I like how you get into concrete examples. So my question has to do with the perception among some stakeholders at the UN, but also within the broader international community, that the way climate and security is entering agendas is still very much Northern dominated. Even the climate and security mechanism has been funded by rich countries. The think tanks that are involved, a lot of them are located in Europe and the United States. So I wanted to ask you, from a political standpoint, but also in terms of effectiveness, how can this imbalance be prevented? How can more actors from the Global South be incorporated into the agenda setting in the way that these solutions are proposed? Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. Feels anybody on the panel comfortable taking this very, very important and at the same time not easy question? Louisa, maybe? Yeah.
Yes, Adriana, I think you really make a fair point. And I have also said in some context that this field sometimes seems a bit the beauty contest among, countries and in the UN Security Council, which is of course overstating the issue because it's an issue of an importance. What I also realize is that it's true that most of the research perhaps is produced by the Western think tanks and most of the analysis and most of the donor budgets being made available. But I also see in our work that the moment you speak to people in other countries of the world where climate vulnerability and conflict risk is high, that they are very much aware that if you look at Iraq's own security strategy, water is included. That if you look at African Union, climate security is on the agenda. That even you in Brazil are looking into this issue. And we've also seen, for instance, in the context, and Tom will say more about it, Tom Minnendorp, in the context of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. First, we had military from the NATO countries, from the Western countries joining, but then we also found more military staff from other continents and other countries joining. And also, I think in our own approach in the Planetary Security Initiative, in the past years, we have organized these big conferences in The Hague, but now in this new phase, and Tobias can say more about it, we also aim to go more, to affected countries. And we've just started, for instance, to cooperate with researchers from Iraq and journalists from Iraq to produce in their own language, for own outlets, their own work in this field. And I guess that's also, let's say, the way this field is evolving and should be evolving. And finally, perhaps for our study on the military, we also for this purpose included Jordan. And we saw in Jordan also that the military is very much experienced, for instance, in operating in water-scarce regions. So I think also there is, let's say, more scope to learn from such practices. Yeah, thanks.
Please, Thomas.
Thanks, Tobias. Thanks, Lucia, and thanks, Adriana. That's a really good question, and I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of making sure this is a global agenda, at least, if not an agenda owned by affected countries. And frankly, I think the first thing we have to admit is that it's an easy trap to fall into to maintain this amongst the usual suspects, if you will. So definitely starts with effort. It starts with a dedicated commitment and an effort to reach out and ensure that this is not what you're saying it might become, i.e. an Northern or Western agenda. I think there are a few things we can do. The first one is maybe to broaden the conversation, to include more stakeholders around the table. And that means taking the conversation away, for instance, from the conference centers of New York and Geneva and Amsterdam and Brussels and London, and take it to the field. The more you localize this kind of conversation, I think the more it enables and empowers voices of communities that are affected and they're living this on a daily basis. I think that's one way to do it. It helps to promote traditional knowledge. It helps to amplify lived experiences rather than our technical, analytical sort of research findings that we have in the reports. And the CSM, the Climate Security Mechanism in the UN, is trying to do that. We're trying to work with partners. I gave the example of the Pacific Islands Forum in the Pacific. We're now also rolling out work with ECOWAS in Central Africa. The UN is also working closely with ECOWAS in West Africa, with IGAD in the Horn of Africa. So working through these regional, sub-regional organizations as a means to localize or regionalize the agenda, I think is a very important one. A second area could be, of course, funding is at the end of the day, the buck stops where the sort of the funding goes. So, and that's maybe something certainly for the UN, but also for the large donors to make an effort and incentivize work that does include local, national, regional counterparts in our work. So it does not become an outside-in type of intervention, but rather provide incentives to ensure funding is being used and implemented jointly with partners on the ground. And then lastly, I would say a third area that's probably important is how we frame it, how we talk about climate security or climate-related security risks. The more dogmatic we become in search of a globally valid and globally accurate climate security definition that works everywhere, the more complicated we make it to have this agenda be accepted and understood around the world in different places. So in a way, it's a self-defeating purpose. We want to make this a big agenda, but we need to understand it's so contextual, it's so localized and so regional that if we have a very strict dogma in how we talk about it, we will alienate people who have lived this experience for a long time and who maybe don't look at it as climate change, but we heard earlier, and I think Selena was also talking about climate variability rather than climate change in many contexts. So we need to have a flexible framing understanding of what it means when we talk about climate change and security, and that allows for regional and local adaptation to of the framing to a specific context, and will also enable more buy-in from national and local actors.
Selena, you want to?
Yes, it's interesting. I was just thinking about what Thomas was just saying about being dogmatic. I do think one issue we came across again and again is the sort of the incredibly complex and poorly defined lexicon in this space, and how everybody uses terminology differently. And it does actually create challenges in bringing different communities of practice together. So perhaps we can define the concepts better while leaving the content to be, context specific. I think I'm kind of agreeing with the others in that saying we may be having the sort of intellectual discussion about it, but the countries where we're working are living it. So they don't need a conference to understand the sort of security risks related to climate change, because it's life and death where they are. The work IISD is doing on national adaptation plans, the ones that already include peace outcomes aren't the United States. They're Togo, Kenya, Ethiopia, Cameroon, Sudan, Burkina Faso. I think that it's something that people are incredibly alert to. And then just from a sort of development practitioner, yes, there's the north-south issue. For me, there's also the outsider-insider issue. The technocrats, the development experts from the West are very good at coming up with, solutions to many of the challenges. But thank heavens the aid community has moved on, and certainly Mercy Corps find that if we're trying to identify what makes a community resilient and to the threats they are likely to face, the community have the answer. And I think it reflects what Thomas was saying about the governments have the answer. It's something that can't be imposed from outside. It's very context specific, but they're the experts, not us.
Thank you, Selena. Talking about context specific ownership, stakeholders, and the local level, I would like to bring in the second question with Siebert Notenboom, and right after also the question of Wim Zwijnenburg, which are related to this topic, and might go even a bit more into detail and one layer further down to get more specific. So I think there's a lot to be discussed after these questions. So Siebert, please.
Well, thank you, Tobias. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly fine.
Okay, that's good. Well, first, congratulations I think this is all very interesting. The question that keeps me busy the past few years is that in my view, we are trying to build resilience into areas that are sensitive for the effects of climate change. And it seems to me that the populations in these areas should primarily be responsible for that by themselves, to the extent possible. But if they have a weak governance capacity in these areas, like is the case in many parts of fragile countries, of course, the international community would be they might try to help, but still, the solutions that are developed should somehow be supported by the population. And I was wondering if you agree with that, and if you see any way to, let's say, to help this this ownership in the population emerge. So that's my question.
Thank you. And Wim, will you maybe just add your question as well at this point?
Sure, and thank you very much for this. A part of my question was already answered in the first question. So let me follow up on that. With regard to the work we're doing in Iraq, we also noticed that a lot of the time our local groups and local grievances around climate-induced security problems are not properly addressed, or are part of a larger problem that the local population is struggling with. For example, with the water crisis in southern Iraq, it's a multiple factor problem, and for them it's not much as focused on climate or water security related issues, but it's part of a larger thing. So the question would then be, on how can we build some kind of accountability mechanisms for governments on their climate security ambitions, where those kind of concerns from local groups are incorporated and are heard in this, because to bridge that disconnect between what the government is saying in public fora and what the people are voicing on the streets with regards to their grievances on climate-related issues, which are connected also to a failure of the government to tackle these issues.
Thank you, Wim. Back to the panel. Who feels addressed? Please, Louisa.
Yeah, I think with regard to the military, this very famous phrase is winning the hearts and minds of people. The realization that if you operate somewhere and the people are against you, then it's going to be very hard. I think it's essential indeed to think about, how to include, involve, engage them. And again, I think with the Planetary Security Initiative, we also work with Free Press Unlimited, and we've started up with working with local journalists. We very much realize this necessity to, let's say, open up a civic space also in these fields, and in that way also include the people. And I think this is also, for instance, EcoPeace Middle East was mentioned. This is also something that EcoPeace Middle East is doing in a super good way. I mean, this is people from the region working in the field, organizing cooperation among mayors, for instance, from Palestine, Israel, and Jordan. So I think these are very, let's say, good examples of, let's say, how to do it and how it could be done. I'll leave it here.
Thanks. Yeah, very, very good questions to go to the heart of the challenge at hand here. I would say to the first question, let's see what raised. Climate change is never the full story. I think we'll agree that the climate change is rarely, if ever, the cause of insecurity. So when you say that it's sort of contextualized in a raft of other issues, I think it's really important to keep in mind that we don't isolate climate change and look at that as the main issue, but we situate it in the context of socioeconomic, political, demographic pressures that are already there, and then we analyze how climate change aggravates or compounds these risks and what the capacity and the vulnerabilities are to cope with this that are already in the states, in the communities that are affected by this. And the climate security toolbox that I mentioned earlier, our guidance materials talk about that as well at length. It's also interesting the way you framed it in terms of insecurity and state fragility already prevents or sort of puts communities and countries in a situation that makes it difficult for them to address climate change as an issue. I think it's entirely true. And that's the vicious cycle that climate change and security can create, where a lack of security and stability and good governance prevents you from addressing climate change effects and prevents you from doing sustainable climate adaptation, which then leads to more disasters, which creates more security risks, and before you know it, you're stuck in this trap and this vicious cycle of disaster and conflict. But in terms of bringing the population, the affected populations and communities, I think Selena said it well. We don't need to teach them the problem. We need to teach ourselves the problems because we don't live them as much. But for them, they know the problems. It's more about co-creating sustainable solutions. And there's some really good examples out there about climate resilient livelihoods, alternative livelihood options that can be co-created and create a new sort of understanding of risks and solutions. And I think something to keep in mind here is that even though we look at climate-related security risks as potentially hard security issues that may trouble the military, the solutions long-term are not military solutions. They usually tend to be from the development side, building resilience. So it's a hard security problem without hard security solutions, which makes it conceptually difficult, but also hard to implement in practice. And then to Wim's question, if I understood it correctly, sort of around the accountability also for governments, and I suppose it would also apply to the UN and other actors and NGOs who work in these areas. It's a critical question, of course, and I mean there's a whole body of literature on accountability in development work. I would say for government specifically, if that's sort of where the holistic approach comes in. We need to think big picture on how these different risk factors come together. And one entry point in that sense might be, for instance, NDCs and NAPs and the National Adaptation Plans under the Paris Agreement. These offer really interesting entry points to understand how vulnerabilities and grievances can be addressed through climate adaptation. And in the process of that, we can also build an accountability mechanisms with parliamentary oversight to ensure that what is being put into these major plans will also be implemented as such.
Selena, you opened your microphone.
I did, because I mainly want to say I'm going to invite Thomas onto every panel I'm ever on defending the role of development, because they are hard security problems with development solutions. I just wanted to flag in terms of the sort of community participation, there are some really excellent pieces of work. The Christian Aid and Cord Aid, I think, participatory vulnerability assessments, the work the Mercy Corps does, the stress analysis, and the work actually we're doing with the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance that is around identifying capacities for resilience to flooding specifically, which is a single threat but relevant, is almost entirely based on the community's own views, solutions, capacities. So it is very, very much driven by them. And I think that's come on a really long way in the last 10 years.
Thank you, Selena. In view of time, we are almost at the end of our Q&A session, but I think for one more question, we still have time, and that brings us also back to the COVID-19 dimension. So I would ask Karen Arnon, please.
Yes, thank you, Tobias. My name is Karen Arnon. I work at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands. My question is indeed about the opportunities to build back better. I mean, COVID-19 has set us back in our common efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Goals. We're faced now with bigger challenges, less time to address them. And this means that we need to address the pandemic and related challenges together with a more coherent set of interventions. So what concrete opportunities do you see from a climate security perspective to build back better? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that is a good question for the final round. Maybe we could go this time in reverse order, Selena.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, this is that was my response on the issue around, massive increase in global needs whilst shrinking resources. I do think you're absolutely right. We can't set these needs up in opposition to each other or as a zero-sum game. We have to find solutions that can address the threats facing a community. For us, actually one of the most interesting things about this project was working across the different communities that are working on these issues and realizing how much they do not work together. They don't communicate. They don't learn from each other. They use different language. They meet in different forums. They work at different scales. And I think it's a real missed opportunity. We need the climate scientists and the adaptation experts to work alongside the peace building experts to really drive that agenda. And actually Mercy Corps has combined our peace building and resilience departments on this project so that we can do that, because there was even a silo within our own community. The opportunities are obviously very specific to the particular context. My bigger fear actually is that we'll build back worse, and that we will, as people migrate, as people have fewer opportunities, they will be moving into flood prone areas, or they will be less able to cope with drought. I think that actually is my greatest fear, but I hope we'll achieve that positive outcome of build back better.
Yeah, also a really good question. I'm just picking up where Selena left off. One of the first things I would say is that whatever we do in building back needs to consider climate risks every step of the way in the design and implementation of our measures. And the example about moving into flood-prone areas, for instance, I think is a very good one. And of course, there are all the other exposed areas around low-lying coastal areas and whatnot. So one way to address building back better is to integrate climate risks every step of the way. I also think staying at the more national or subnational local level is that the COVID response, I think in many cases, exposed weaknesses that will also be exploited by climate change if they aren't already. Think about the health response, think about communication between communities, think about some basic protocols and vulnerabilities. We know that climate change will pounce probably even harder and for a more extended period of time than COVID does. So what we have learned now, weaknesses, is a blueprint for what we need to fix to also address climate change. And then lastly, sort of at the global level, I would also say that at the end of the day, the best defense against climate-related security risks is still a reduction in the carbon footprint long term. Of course, we know that carbon emissions stay in the atmosphere for a very long time, so already damage is done and it will get worse. But long term, really, the Paris Agreement is our best defense against climate-related security risks. So building back better in a way that creates green energies and green jobs and sustainable sort of policies and ways of living long term will have a huge implication positively on climate security. And I would just point you to some of the statements that the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has made in this regard that lay out sort of plans and policies in that regard.
Thank you. Louise?
Yes, I was just seeing that there's still so many more interesting questions also being placed into the comment box. I wanted to thank everybody also for posing these and looking into these. I agree with Thomas very much that I think with the Building Back Better, we also have to take into consideration that there will be new investments now that can shift, let's say, from the gray to the green economy, and that also there's a lot of opportunity, especially also in the poorer parts of the world and conflict-prone parts of the world, to do leapfrogging immediately to renewable solutions, which are often very much more localized. So I think, let's say, adaptation is important, but we should also not forget the potential synergies between the peace and climate mitigation agenda. I also wanted to point out that, unfortunately, in terms of best practices, I saw also a question of Roel Rijland from Luxembourg on that. There isn't that much yet available. So what Mercy Corps found on the ground, what Thomas is alluding to, the examples of EcoPeace Middle East, Triple S, you know, there are examples, but it's still early days in this field, and I really hope this is not going to be killed, you know, by mistaken short budget cuts on programs and efforts, because I guess it's even more needed. We see, you know, the first positive effects of looking through a climate lens at peace interventions and using climate interventions for peace building. And let's not, you know, at this stage already kill it, but please keep on track and also try to learn more indeed among the sectors and among the communities. I think that's important. I saw that Ietse de Vries from Ministry of Defense asked if the Ministry of Defense should now be more pronounced on climate change as a key threat. And I think that is also really interesting then to go to Tom and to hear, let's say, his contribution. Thanks.
Exactly. That is was a very nice. It's a very nice binding element. First of all, thanks for the questions. Also to those that could unfortunately not be answered anymore. And thanks for the debate and your answers on the panel. And now, as already mentioned, we come to the concluding spoken column by General Tom Middendorp, sketching out how climate change might shape the global security agenda in the next month. So also here, I would like to pack it into or give you a very concrete question. So what should the Munich Security Conference discuss in February 2021 in the field of climate security? Please, Tom, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Tobias, and thank you all for this very fruitful discussion that we just had. Well, listening to today's discussion, I will share some of my thoughts on what I think the next Munich Security Conference or any other regional security conference should discuss when it comes to the climate security nexus. Let me first stress that I'm not a politician. I'm also not a climate activist. I'm here as a security expert associated to the Klingendahl Institute, but also as the chairman of the International Military Council on Climate and Security, a council consisting of a fast-growing group of very concerned senior military and non-military security experts and research institutes from 40 countries from all continents. And this allows this council to also act as a platform to involve the expertise of those countries and the best practices that are already out there, also from non-Western countries and from fragile states. And all of these experts have experienced that there is no security without development, and that there is no development without security. So let's stop thinking in stovepipes. And we are concerned. We are concerned because we share a very firm belief that the warning signs are flashing red, that climate change is an immediate and existential threat to humanity, to our very own existence. And I don't have to tell you why. It's with good reason that many people say we are now at a critical juncture, a kind of a tipping point, where the threat of climate change is leading to growing instability, fear, crisis, and potential conflict. That's also why I was very glad to address this on the stage in the Munich Security Conference this year. And here I had the opportunity to share the work and experiences of our council and presented our first global climate and security report. And this report depicted the security impacts of our changing climate in the different regions of the world, using the input of the experts that we have available in those countries. And it was for the first time in their history that climate security was featured at the main stage in the Munich Security Conference. Climate change was discussed as one of the most important threats of our time. And that turned this conference into a wake-up call for the security community, realizing that they also have a responsibility to act. Climate change is not a security problem as such, and the military is certainly not the answer to climate change. However, climate change does have a huge security implication, and the security community absolutely needs to be part of the solution. Now, what does that mean for the next Munich Security Conference or any other conference in the coming year? How can these conferences move beyond recognizing the existential danger of climate change and beyond adding another call for action? To take climate security discussions to a next level, we need to shift our efforts from calling for action to designing and initiating action. Now, let me give you 5 more specific options that could be put on the agenda of any of these conferences. First, there is the element of foresight. The military understands the importance of being ahead of the game, since the lives of their soldiers will need to be put at risk if we fail to do so. So how can the military contribute to a more comprehensive forecasting of climate security effects that allows us to act more preventively and proactively? A second question would be how to adapt at a strategic level. What should be the role of the security sector in addressing climate change? And how should security institutions like NATO adapt to the geopolitical impact of climate change? The third line of questioning could be about building local and regional resilience. How can we mitigate or prevent the security effects of climate change? And here, the conference could discuss new approaches towards climate vulnerability and conflict-prone regions and exchange best practices in helping improve local resilience. And a final element could be about force adaptation. How can we climate-proof our forces, enable them to act in extreme circumstances, protect our vital infrastructure and materiel against climate influences, and reduce the ecological footprint of our forces? Green technologies are an important part of the solution and can help security forces to become more self-supporting and reduce their footprint. Now, why can't we use defense as a platform for green innovation? Ladies and gentlemen, we need these conferences to move beyond calling for action. Never in our history did we have so much strategic foresight, so much knowledge, and so much collective power at our disposal. The COVID crisis shows us how important it is to be prepared, to not let time slip through our fingers until it's too late. It also confronted us with the vulnerability of the global village that we live in. We can't hide behind our dikes or national borders. We have a responsibility to act, to adapt, and to build resilience collectively. And the military needs to be part of that solution. Or perhaps I should paraphrase a former French statesman, Georges Clemenceau, who once famously said, "War is too important to be left to generals." I would say climate change is too big and too important to be left to the environmental ministries. It's a whole of society problem, requiring whole of society answers. We need everybody to act, to rise above political and national agendas, and to look further ahead than the next quarterly journal or the next election period. Because our success lies in our collective ability to act. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for this great contribution. Thanks also to all the panelists and the speakers, and thanks to the participants here in the Zoom room and also out there on YouTube. Allow me just a very last note. In the first half of July, PSI and Klingendal will organize another webinar in the realm of climate security. By then, we will discuss climate, water, and security in Iraq. The respective information and announcement you will find on the PSI and the Klingendal website. Thanks again to all of you, and have a nice afternoon. For some of you, a great Friday and a nice evening, and for all of you, a wonderful weekend. Thank you, and see you next time. Thanks.